I had always wanted to spend some time alone in the countryside of France. Not the tourist version of France, the cities and cobblestone streets and cafes that people put on postcards, but the real part, the rural part. I was living in Lyon at the time, doing freelance IT work that allowed me to travel a bit. Most of my jobs were remote, just long hours of coding, fixing systems, and responding to emails. That summer, I told myself I needed to take a proper break from the screen. So I packed up my old Renault Clio and headed into the Parc Naturel Regional du Haut-Jura in eastern France, not far from the Swiss border. I was 33 back then. It was early September 2019, the kind of month where the air is cool in the morning but still warm by midday. I didn't tell many people about my trip, just a few close friends back home in the UK, and I dropped a quick email to a cousin in Marseille in case anything went wrong. I don't think anyone paid much attention, and I liked it that way. I wanted space, time to clear my head. No city noise, no lights, no interruptions. I had chosen a place that was marked as a wild camping-friendly area on a French hiking forum. The specific spot wasn't even labeled on Google Maps. You had to take a dirt track off the D437, follow it about 4 kilometers into the woods, and then walk another 15 minutes along an overgrown footpath that ran beside a shallow stream. It wasn't a real campsite, just a clearing surrounded by pine trees and a soft patch of grass large enough for a tent or two. The stream nearby provided water, and the whole area was dead quiet. No cell service, no man-made noise, just forest. I got there on a Thursday afternoon. The sun was bright, and the clearing looked perfect. I pitched my green decathlon tent quickly and set up a simple fire pit using a few large rocks and some dry twigs. I'd brought a small cooler with cheese, cured meat, some hard bread, and 2 bottles of water. I also had a camping stove in case I needed it, but I planned on keeping things simple. I didn't bring too much gear, just a sleeping bag, a foam mat, a knife, a flashlight, a headlamp, some batteries, and a heavy wool blanket. I wanted to live rough for a few days, just feel disconnected. The first night was peaceful. I fell asleep to the sound of crickets and the occasional owl in the trees above. It got cold around 2 a.m., but I was warm inside my sleeping bag. I woke up at dawn with dew on the tent and a thin mist hanging in the trees. It was beautiful. I made a coffee on the stove and sat on a log by the fire pit, staring at the trees while I sipped it. There was no one out here, just me and the forest. The second night, something felt different. It started with the sense that I wasn't entirely alone. It's hard to explain, but anyone who's spent time outdoors alone will probably understand. That low-level tension, your brain picking up on something your eyes and ears haven't registered yet. Around dusk, I took a short walk away from the clearing, following the stream upstream to where it curved into a rockier section of forest. That's when I saw a small stack of rocks, 3 or 4, carefully balanced in a way that looked deliberate. At first, I didn't think much of it. People leave stuff like that around sometimes. But then I saw another stack about 10 meters further along. Then another, all of them neatly placed, in a line that almost followed the stream's path. There were at least 7 of them. I walked past each one slowly. None of them looked especially old. No moss on them, no leaves caught underneath. The dirt around some of the bases looked freshly disturbed. Someone had made them recently. That's when I noticed a torn piece of red fabric caught on a thorn bush nearby. It looked like it had been part of a jacket or shirt. Something about it unsettled me. I took a few photos on my old Nikon and walked back to camp. That night, I had trouble falling asleep. I lay there listening to the woods. There were the normal forest sounds, wind through branches, the occasional creak of a tree shifting, small animals moving through the brush. But then, around 1:30 a.m., I heard something that didn't belong. It sounded like soft crunching, footsteps, not heavy ones, but slow, deliberate ones. Not an animal. I stayed still in my sleeping bag and listened, heart thudding in my ears. The steps came from the direction of the stream, then paused. For about 2 minutes, there was nothing. Then I heard a soft click-click sound, like someone lightly tapping 2 stones together. It happened 3 times. Then silence. I didn't move. I just waited, gripping my knife in the dark, not even daring to switch on the flashlight. I lay awake until the sky began to lighten around 5 a.m. That morning, I checked the perimeter of the clearing. I didn't find any footprints, just flattened grass in one spot near the edge of the trees. It might have been from an animal, or it might not have. I should have packed up and left right then. But I didn't. I told myself I was overreacting, that it was probably a hiker passing through or a fox or nothing at all. I had 2 more nights planned. I wasn't gonna run because of a few rocks and strange noises. I didn't want to believe I was in danger. That afternoon, I hiked further up the path I had taken the first day. About 2 kilometers from camp, I found an old wooden hunting blind half hidden in a patch of dense trees. It was run down, planks rotting, moss growing on the walls, but it looked like someone had been there recently. There was a crumpled can of instant coffee beside the blind, and what looked like fresh boot prints in the mud nearby. I felt a chill crawl down my back. That blind hadn't been mentioned on any of the hiking forums. I went inside. It smelled like damp wood and old cigarettes. The view from the slit in the wall overlooked the stream. You could see the clearing from there. My tent was barely visible through the trees. Someone had been watching this area. Maybe still was. I hiked back fast, glancing over my shoulder the whole time. Back at camp, I grabbed the cooler and stuffed what I could into my backpack. I knew I couldn't make it back to the car that night. It would be too dark to see the track, and the forest was thick. But I didn't want to sleep at the clearing again. I walked about 1 kilometer in the opposite direction, toward a rocky slope I remembered passing. There were a few boulders there, and I tucked myself behind one of them and set up my tent in a narrow patch of flat ground. It wasn't ideal, but I didn't want to be where I'd been the past 2 nights. That night was quiet at first. The wind had picked up, and the trees made constant whispering noises. I stayed awake with my knife and flashlight next to me. Around 3 a.m., I heard something again. A stick breaking, then another click-click sound. This time it was closer. It wasn't an animal. I was sure of that now. It was someone. I switched off my headlamp and waited. Then I saw it. A figure, about 15 meters away, just past a tree. I couldn't make out his face, but he was tall and thin. He wasn't holding a light, just standing there, watching. I held my breath, afraid to move. He didn't come closer, just stood like that for at least 5 minutes. Then he slowly turned and disappeared behind the trees. I didn't sleep. I packed everything at first light and began the hike back to the car. The path was rough and I slipped twice on wet stones. I didn't stop to rest. I didn't eat. I reached the dirt road after 2 hours, my legs shaking. When I got to my car, I found a small pile of stones stacked on the hood, just like the ones by the stream. My stomach dropped. I looked around, no one. I didn't waste a second. I unlocked the door and got in. Drove out of there as fast as the road would let me. I never went back to that part of Jura again. I don't camp alone anymore either. I still don't know who that man was or what he wanted. I reported it to the local gendarmerie in St. Claude a day later, showed them the photos, told them about the noises and the man. They took notes but didn't seem too concerned. Said it was probably a hunter or some recluse. But I know what I saw. He wasn't passing through. He was waiting, watching, tracking. And if I hadn't moved camp that night, I think something worse might have happened. Maybe he wanted to scare me off. Maybe he was playing some twisted game. Or maybe he was planning something else entirely. Something worse. I still think about those rocks. The way he clicked them together in the dark. The way he stood so still, like he'd been waiting a long time for something. That look of patience, even though I couldn't see his eyes. The quiet, Deliberate presence. No talking.
No rushing.
Just that awful stillness. I keep that knife with me now every time I go into the woods, but I don't think it would have made much difference if he had really wanted to do something. I think I was lucky, that's all. Just lucky. I had just turned 34 that spring, and after years of saying I would do it, I finally cleared a weekend to take a solo camping trip out west. I was living in southern Missouri at the time, managing to get some freelance work going that gave me the flexibility I hadn't had in years. Life was quiet. I didn't have a partner or kids. Most of my friends were scattered across the country. I thought a weekend by myself in nature would be a good way to reset, maybe even come back with a better outlook on things. I was tired of being online all the time. Tired of apartment walls, tired of artificial lighting. I picked a spot outside of a small town in northern Utah. A friend from college, Scott, had gone hiking out that way the year before and told me about a lightly trafficked Forest Service road that led to a remote plateau with a view of the entire valley. He'd mentioned the area was technically part of the Uinta Mountains, but the particular ridge wasn't close to any maintained trails or campgrounds. It was just forest and rock, open space and silence. Exactly what I was looking for. Scott had camped there with a buddy and said they hadn't seen a single other person for 3 days. He sent me coordinates, and I saved them in my GPS. I left on a Friday morning in mid-June 2018. I had a decent old Subaru with all-wheel drive, enough clearance to handle rough dirt roads. I brought everything I thought I'd need: tent, sleeping bag, bear spray, small propane stove, cooler with dry ice and food, first aid kit, emergency beacon, the works. I'd even bought a Garmin satellite communicator since I wouldn't have cell service up there. My plan was to drive most of the way, hike the last couple of miles, and camp 2 nights. I didn't tell many people about it. Just my sister, who lived in Nebraska, and a neighbor who watered my plants while I was gone. The drive out was long, but smooth. I made it to the forest road by about 4 p.m. on Friday. The sun was still high and the sky was perfectly clear. I remember the air being so crisp it almost felt fake. The road twisted up through scattered pine and dry hills, eventually turning into gravel and then just packed dirt. It climbed higher and higher until I reached the start of the hike, a pull-off on the side of a narrow bend where the woods thickened around the ridge. I parked, locked the car, strapped on my pack, and headed up. The hike wasn't long, maybe 2 miles, but it was steep. The ridge sloped up fast, and the dirt turned to loose stone for most of the climb. By the time I got to the top, my shirt was stuck to my back with sweat and my legs were shaky, but the view was exactly what I'd hoped for. Trees stretched out below me in all directions, and past them, the mountains ran along the horizon in jagged layers. No buildings, no people, no noise. Just birds, the wind, and the occasional creak of branches moving against one another. I found a flat spot near a cluster of tall pines and set up camp, pitched the tent, gathered some dry sticks for a small fire, and made a quick dinner from a freeze-dried pouch. It got cold fast once the sun dropped. I remember pulling on my second hoodie and sitting by the fire, staring out over the dark valley below. The stars were the clearest I'd seen in years. There was no moon, and with no city lights around, the sky looked like a dome filled with glitter. I went to bed early that night, probably around 9:30. The ground was harder than I expected, and I didn't sleep well. At some point around midnight, I woke up to a sound, like a crunching or a snap. It wasn't close. It sounded maybe a few hundred feet off in the trees. I froze, listening. It came again, a quick rustle, followed by nothing. I laid there stiff for a long time, bear spray next to my sleeping bag. I figured it was a deer or maybe a raccoon. I tried not to let my imagination take over. Eventually, I must have dozed back off. Saturday morning was still and quiet. I made instant coffee and sat by the fire pit, just watching the wind move through the trees. I hiked a little along the ridge during the day, not straying too far from camp. I had that calm, heavy feeling you only get when you're alone in the woods with no timeline. Time slows down in a place like that. Everything feels sharper, more vivid. But there was also a faint feeling in the back of my mind that didn't go away all day. Not fear exactly, just a kind of awareness, like I was being watched. I kept checking behind me when I walked, kept stopping to listen. I chalked it up to being by myself in a new place. That afternoon, I noticed something strange. Down the slope, maybe 40 yards from my tent, there were signs someone had been there before. A rough fire ring, just a circle of half-buried stones, and a half-rotted tarp half-covered in pine needles. It didn't look recent, but still, it wasn't on any map, and Scott hadn't mentioned another camp. I didn't think too much of it. People camp in weird places all the time. As the sun went down Saturday night, I started to get a stronger sense of unease. Not from anything specific. Nothing had happened, but something about the silence felt wrong. The birds had stopped earlier than they had the night before. The wind was still. Even the chipmunks that had darted around all day were gone. Felt too quiet. That night, I didn't sleep much. I lay in my bag with my eyes open, listening. Around 1 a.m., I heard the crunch of footsteps again. This time, closer. Definitely not an animal. Too steady. 2 feet, one step after another, slow. I held my breath. The steps circled to the back of my tent, paused, then continued downhill. I sat up, heart hammering in my chest. I didn't move. I didn't unzip the tent. I didn't grab my flashlight. I just waited. Minutes passed, then an hour. Nothing. At dawn, I unzipped the tent and stepped outside. The forest looked the same as always. But when I checked the soft dirt near the tent's rear corner, I found them boot prints. A single set. Not mine. The tread was wider and deeper, like from a heavy hiking boot. The steps came from the tree-line, circled the tent, and went back into the woods. I packed everything in less than 15 minutes. I didn't eat, didn't boil water, didn't brush my teeth. I shoved the tent into its sack without folding it. I stuffed the rest of my gear into the backpack and hit the trail. I didn't run. I didn't want to twist an ankle, but I moved fast. I kept looking back over my shoulder. The air felt thinner. Every crack of a twig made my stomach twist. It felt like I was being followed, even though I couldn't see anyone. I got back to the car by late morning. My hands were shaking as I unlocked the door. I threw my gear in the back and drove out, tires spinning a little on the loose gravel. I didn't stop until I reached a gas station near Vernal. I sat there in the car for a long time trying to calm down. I didn't call the police. I didn't report it to the Forest Service. What would I say? That someone walked near my tent at night? That I saw boot prints? They wouldn't send a search team over that. I told myself it was probably just another camper who saw my fire or heard me walking around and got curious. Maybe they thought I was someone they knew. Maybe they got lost and were checking for help. But deep down, I knew that wasn't it. Whoever it was didn't try to say anything. Didn't come during the day. They waited until night, until I was asleep. That night, I stayed in a cheap motel and double-locked the door. I didn't sleep well. For weeks afterward, I kept thinking about what would have happened if I'd unzipped the tent, or if I hadn't woken up at all, or if I'd stayed another night. There are places out in the woods where no one can hear you scream. That ridge was one of them. I never went camping alone again. Not once. Sometimes I dream about it. About the sound of those footsteps behind the tent. Slow, deliberate. The pause. The silence that followed. And always I wake up before I see their face. It was October 2021 when I decided to take a hunting trip alone. I was 36 at the time, working from home a lot more due to the pandemic and all that, and my head had been full of noise for months. I needed a break from screens and people, so I picked a long weekend, loaded up my gear, and drove out to northern Idaho. I'd camped and hunted a few times before, mostly with friends, but this trip I wanted to be by myself. I wanted the quiet. I drove nearly 6 hours from Spokane to a thick, remote patch of forest near Priest Lake. Not the fancy lakeside cabins or the tourist parts, but deeper up the mountain, away from cell signal and traffic. I had mapped out a few clearings on the satellite view where elk had been spotted earlier in the year. I also had a GPS device with offline maps, a solar charger, and plenty of backup batteries. I didn't take stupid risks. I parked off a logging road that looked like no one had touched it in years. Branches scraped the sides of my truck as I pulled in, and I had to chainsaw a fallen log that was blocking the path just half a mile from where I wanted to set up camp. That little detour added an hour and some sweat to the afternoon, but I liked it. That's what I came for. Just me, my tools, and the woods. I set up camp near a shallow ravine, a bit downhill from an open ridge that looked like a good spot for glassing in the mornings. I had a sturdy canvas tent, a propane heater, a cot with a thick sleeping pad, and a small wood stove I'd use for warmth and cooking. I set up a tarp for rain protection, staked down everything, and hung my food high off a pine with bare line. I even set up a motion alarm perimeter, not because I was afraid of animals, more just a habit from trips with friends. The first night was calm, cold but quiet. I remember cooking a can of chili and some rice, sitting on a folding chair by the small fire, watching the steam drift up past the lantern glow. I heard the usual forest sounds: wind, dry branches creaking, some small animals crunching through leaves, but nothing out of the ordinary. The next morning I woke up early, my breath fogged in the cold. It was still pitch black when I climbed out of the tent and brewed a pot of coffee with the stove. I strapped on my gear, rifle, binos, a thermos, emergency kit, radio, and hiked up to the ridge before first light. The air smelled sharp, full of pine and frost. I didn't see anything that first morning. No movement at all, which surprised me. The terrain looked perfect for elk. Old tracks, droppings, fresh scrapes on tree bark. I stayed up there until about 10 a.m., glassing the tree lines, listening, but nothing moved. The second day was the same. Cold mornings, silent woods. I tracked deeper along a narrow game trail that led east from camp, marked it on my GPS, and followed it for about 4 miles. I found a dry creek bed and what looked like a bedding area, but it was empty. No fresh prints. That afternoon I got back to camp and found something odd. The motion alarm I set up was turned off. Not broken, not triggered, just off. The switch was flicked to the off position. I stood there for a long time, staring at it, thinking maybe I'd forgotten to turn it on myself. But I remembered clearly testing it the night before. It had chirped when I stepped through it after hanging my food. I walked the perimeter again. Nothing was missing. No tracks, no signs of anyone. It was probably nothing, I told myself. Maybe I'd bumped it in the dark, or the cold drained the battery. Still, I didn't like the feeling it gave me. That night, I didn't sleep well. The wind had picked up and the trees groaned overhead. I kept waking up, hearing little noises that didn't belong. Snaps, scuffles, a sharp tap against the side of the tent that made me sit up fast around 2 a.m. I held my breath for a while, listening. It didn't repeat. Probably just a branch, I told myself again. Probably. By day 3, I started questioning the trip. I was tired, and I still hadn't seen any game. I climbed higher up the ridge and tried scanning the far valley, thinking maybe I just picked a bad spot. That's when I noticed something strange. On a slope about 400 yards away, I saw a shape. At first I thought it was a black bear. Big, dark, hunched over. But it didn't move like a bear. It was crouched still. I pulled out my binos and looked closer. It was a man. He was sitting low behind a boulder, dressed in dark clothes, barely visible in the brush. I wouldn't have seen him if the sun hadn't caught the lens of whatever scope he had. I saw the glint just for a second. I kept watching him for 10, maybe 15 minutes. He didn't move much, didn't look around, just sat there like he was waiting. For what? I didn't know. It spooked the hell out of me. I was miles into the forest, way off the beaten path. No hunting tags on that side of the valley as far as I knew. No reason for someone to just be crouched behind a rock, not moving. I backed away slowly and hiked back to camp the long way, using the trees for cover. I didn't want whoever it was to know I'd seen them. Back at camp, everything looked the same except the tarp above my food line was cut. Not torn, cut clean through in a straight line. The food was untouched, but the tarp was slashed neatly like someone had taken a knife to it. That was enough for me. I packed up fast. I didn't even eat. Just threw everything into the truck as quick as I could. I started the engine and drove out, bouncing down that overgrown road, pushing through brush and praying I didn't get stuck. When I finally hit the main road again, I stopped at a small ranger station about 20 miles south. I told them what happened, about the man on the slope, the motion alarm, the tarp. They were polite, but clearly didn't know what to do with the story. They took my name and the coordinates I marked and said they'd send someone up to check. That was it. I drove home that night, exhausted, my nerves shot. I kept checking my mirrors the whole way, feeling like someone was going to come speeding up behind me. But no one did. The next morning, after a long sleep and a hot shower, I checked my GPS tracker data and found the exact timestamp when I'd seen the man. I zoomed in on the slope, but it didn't show much, just trees and rocks. I didn't know what to do with that either. About a week later, I got a call from the ranger station. They said they went to the coordinates I gave, but didn't find anything. No sign of a person. No camp, no gear, no tracks. The cut tarp and switched off motion alarm? Could have been anything, they said. Maybe an animal, maybe weather. They thanked me for the report and that was it. But I know what I saw. That guy wasn't hunting. He wasn't hiking. He was watching. And I'll always believe he came to my camp at night. Maybe more than once, just to see what I had, maybe to see if I was alone. Maybe to wait. I haven't gone back since. I still hunt sometimes, but only on public land, and never alone. I keep to trails. I tell people where I'm going. I keep my phone on me and a camera recording when I sleep. People think the woods are dangerous because of bears or cold or getting lost. But sometimes it's other people. People who don't talk, don't wave, just watch. And I was lucky. I left before I found out what he wanted. I went camping alone in the summer of 2019. I was 29 back then. My name's Chris Myers. I worked in construction, lived in a rented apartment in Redding, California, and needed a break from the noise, the traffic, and the way people stared at their phones like they were afraid to be alive. I didn't want to go to a beach or visit a city. I wanted silence, trees, dirt. I wanted something that felt real. I drove up north into Oregon past Medford, then cut east toward a less popular section of the Fremont-Winema National Forest. It's not as tourist-heavy as some of the other parks. I had looked it up before and found a place with no real trails, just dispersed camping. A guy I used to work with mentioned it once. He said you could hike deep into the trees and not see another person for days. That's exactly what I wanted. I brought my old red Ford Ranger, a cooler full of food, a tarp, a tent, my sleeping bag, 2 knives, a small hatchet, my Glock 19, a foldable saw, and a pile of other gear I didn't end up needing. I also brought my German Shepherd, Duke. He was 7 at the time. Big dog. Calm, smart, obedient. He was the kind of dog that didn't bark unless something was really off. I parked the truck off a narrow dirt road that ran crooked between two ridges. The road was rough. If you didn't have four-wheel drive, you'd probably get stuck. There weren't any signs or markers. No fences, just a shallow rise of dirt, some old pine needles, and dry grass crushed under my tires. I hiked about 2 miles in. Duke stayed close, sniffing along tree trunks, peeing every 100 feet, his tail relaxed. The trail was barely visible, more like an animal path than anything man-made. I didn't use GPS. I marked trees with orange tape just in case, though I didn't plan to leave the general area. There was a creek a few hundred yards from my camp. I could hear it even before I set up. I found a spot under a wide pine, with thick roots rising around it like arms. The ground was flat. There were broken logs nearby I could sit on. Everything felt calm. Birds, the sound of water, the breeze in the branches above. It was exactly what I had hoped for. I set up camp slowly. Tarp first, then tent, then rolled out my bag and laid out Duke's blanket beside me. I stacked firewood, checked the perimeter, then boiled creek water on my small propane stove. That night I ate beef stew from a can, watched the sky fade orange, then blue, then black. I didn't use a flashlight unless I needed it. I wanted to let my eyes adjust naturally. The air was cool that night. My fire popped gently. Duke rested beside me, his head down, ears still alert. I leaned back on the log and looked up at the stars until I started drifting off. I woke up just after 2 a.m. I know that because I looked at my watch. Duke was standing. His body was stiff. He was staring into the trees behind my tent. No barking, no growling, just focused. The fire had burned down to embers. I sat up slowly and listened. I heard wind, insects, the creek still flowing in the distance. I didn't hear footsteps. I didn't see anything. Still, the way Duke was standing set me on edge. I whispered for him to come. He didn't move. I didn't have a flashlight on, but there was enough moonlight that I could see the shapes of the trees. I stood and slowly stepped toward Duke. He shifted slightly, then looked up at me like he wasn't sure what he saw out there. Then he sat down. I stood there for another 10 minutes watching the trees. Nothing moved. I finally turned back to the tent, added a few sticks to the fire, and laid back down. Duke came in later and curled up by my side. I figured maybe he smelled a deer or a fox. Something wild but not dangerous. Still, something felt off. The next morning, I woke up at dawn, made coffee, scrambled some eggs in a small pan. The light through the trees was beautiful, soft, and slow. Duke ran around sniffing at everything like the night before hadn't happened. I did some small hikes around the area that day, followed the creek up a ways, climbed a small hill that gave me a better view of the woods. I didn't see any people, no campers, no hikers, no tire tracks or boot prints, just pine, rock, and the sound of insects buzzing in the heat. That night, I sat out by the fire again. The wind picked up a little. Not bad, just enough to move the trees. I felt more relaxed than I had the first night. I even cracked a beer and let myself feel proud that I had found such a peaceful place. It was almost midnight when I heard something behind me. Not loud, not dramatic, just one step, one crunch of dry pine needles. I froze. Duke shot up, ears back, head low. His body was tense. His eyes locked on a patch of trees directly behind my tent. I turned slowly, staring into the dark. I couldn't see anything at first. My fire was too bright. My eyes hadn't adjusted. So I stood, grabbed my flashlight, and turned it on. Nothing. The beam moved through the trees. Trunks, branches, brush. Nothing moved. But then, about 20 feet out, I saw something behind a tree. Just a shape. Person, maybe. It was too fast to see clearly. When my light hit the spot, whatever it was had already stepped behind the trunk. I called out, Not with words, but a noise, like a shout, just to let whoever it was know I saw them. No response. I grabbed my pistol from the tent and held it low. Duke was growling now, low and deep, the kind of growl he didn't use for animals. I moved around the fire toward the tree line, flashlight in one hand, gun in the other. "Hey!" I shouted again. "You need something?" Nothing. No footsteps. No voice. Not even the sound of someone walking away. I stood there for maybe 2 minutes, waiting. My heart was pounding, but I kept the light steady. Finally, I walked back to the fire, sat with my back to a tree, facing the dark. Duke didn't relax for a long time. The next morning, I found boot prints. A few of them, not mine, too large, and they didn't come from the direction of the road. They came from deeper in the woods. They circled my camp, from behind the tent, past the fire pit, then off toward the creek. Whoever it was, they'd been watching me. I felt something deep in my gut then. More than fear, I felt hunted. I packed up most of my gear that morning and stashed it in my truck. I didn't leave, not yet, but I didn't want all my supplies sitting out if someone was creeping through the trees. I kept my pistol on my hip and stayed closer to the camp that day. I built a stronger fire ring, cleaned up any trash, burned anything that could smell. I told myself maybe it was just another camper, someone curious, someone lost. But deep down, I didn't believe it. That night, I didn't sleep. Not really. I laid in the tent with Duke beside me, both of us listening. Every twig snap, every gust of wind, every night bird. 3:17 a.m., I heard it again. Footsteps, this time closer. I didn't move. Duke was shaking, not scared, angry. He was ready to attack. I reached for the pistol, unzipped the tent just enough to peek through the mesh. I saw a figure, human, tall, wearing what looked like a hoodie and jeans. But something was off. They weren't standing like people stand. Their back was hunched. Their arms hung low, like they didn't know what to do with them, and they were staring right at the tent. I held my breath. Then the figure turned and ran. But the way it ran made my blood freeze. The arms didn't move naturally. The legs were stiff. It looked like someone who had never run before was trying to mimic it. I jumped out of the tent with the flashlight and gun, swept the woods. Nothing. No sound of running. No branches breaking. Just empty dark. I stayed out there until the sun came up. When I finally walked the path toward where I'd seen the figure, I found more prints. But not full ones. Just the front half, like whoever it was walked on their toes. That's when the idea hit me. The awful idea I didn't want to believe. They were copying me. The shape, the build. The face, I thought I saw myself. I broke camp that morning, fully. Loaded everything into the truck and drove out. Took the same road back, slow and careful. But before I reached the main road, I saw something in the side mirror. A man, standing just where the trees met the road. Not moving, just watching. He looked exactly like me. Same jacket, same jeans, same build, same face, but his arms were too long, and he was smiling, wide and crooked, like he'd practiced it but didn't know why. I didn't stop. I didn't look back again. I drove until I was back in Medford, stayed in a hotel. Told myself I'd been too stressed, that I imagined it. But 2 days later, back in Reading, I got a call from my neighbor. He said he saw me walking around my apartment complex at 3 a.m. Only I wasn't home yet. I was still staying with a friend. I changed apartments the next month, got a better lock, stopped hiking alone. I never told anyone the full story until now, and I don't go into the woods anymore. It was September 2021 when I decided to take a solo camping trip deep into the forests of northern Washington. I was 31 at the time, burnt out from long weeks at the warehouse job in Tacoma. I wanted nothing more than quiet, rain, and woods. I picked a place I'd never been, somewhere north of Colville, out near an old logging road that hadn't seen much use in a decade, according to a blog post I found. The area wasn't exactly marked on maps, but I liked that. I had downloaded the offline map and planned to drive down an old Forest Service road until I found a clearing to camp. I brought everything I needed: tent, sleeping pad, food, water filter, warm clothes, knife, bear spray, and even a small hatchet. Took most of the day to get out there. Once I turned off the highway, the road narrowed fast. First gravel, then dirt, then something barely resembling a road at all. The rain had started lightly in the afternoon. By the time I found a wide enough space to park my truck and hike in, it was more of a steady drizzle. There was a clearing about a quarter mile off the road, tucked behind thick fir trees and some mossy boulders. The floor was flat and soft with pine needles. You could barely hear the road from there, not that anyone would be coming down it. I set up my tent just as the light began to fade behind thick clouds. I skipped a fire. Everything was damp and heavy. I ate a couple of granola bars under the vestibule of the tent while listening to the soft patter of rain on the fly. The forest was alive but quiet.
No distant chainsaws.
No signs of other campers, just birds calling and rain dripping. I crawled into my sleeping bag early. It was colder than I expected, low 40s maybe, and the inside of the tent smelled of damp nylon and earth. I read a few pages of a book on my phone until the battery dipped below 20%. I switched it off and lay back, letting the rain lull me into sleep. I must have fallen asleep before 10. The next time I opened my eyes, I had no idea what time it was. The rain had picked up, hard and fast, drumming against the tent like 1,000 fingertips. At first, I thought it was just the rain. But then I realized I had woken up for a reason. I felt it before I heard anything. You know that feeling you get when someone's watching you, even through a wall? Like your chest tightens and your ears sort of ring? It was that kind of feeling, a gut signal. I lay still and listened. The wind had started to pick up, shaking the tent fabric. But under the wind and rain, I could hear something else. It was faint, barely audible, but it wasn't the wind. It was slow and deliberate, like steps. They weren't close, not at first, but they were getting closer, crunching slowly on wet needles and soft ground. One, then a pause, then another. Not animal movement.
No scary.
Just careful, paced steps. I sat up slowly in my bag. My breath was shallow. I didn't want to move too fast. My eyes were locked on the dark outline of the tent wall. Nothing to see. I reached slowly into my pack and pulled out the bear spray. I held it close, my thumb brushing against the safety. The steps stopped. Then silence, except the wind and rain. I waited. Nothing. 5 minutes passed. Then 10. I almost convinced myself I imagined it, that it was just a branch falling or a deer. But then I heard it again. This time from a different angle. Closer. Still slow. Still pacing. I stayed frozen in place. The hairs on my arms stood up. I held the bear spray tighter. Then came a sound that I can still hear in my head. Even now, something touched the tent. Not hard, just a faint press of fabric near the bottom corner, like a finger running along the edge. Then it stopped again. I didn't breathe for what felt like a minute. I waited for a zipper to move, for something to slice open the wall. Nothing. Then I heard the steps again, walking away this time, slowly, fading into the trees. It didn't make sense. Who the hell would be out here in the woods in the middle of the night, in the rain, with no light? There were no campgrounds for miles, no towns for an hour, and this wasn't a place someone just stumbled on. I stayed awake until the sun started to rise. Every so often I thought I heard a snap or shift in the brush, but I never saw anything through the mesh. My heart was pounding the whole time. When light finally started to bleed through the trees, I got up and packed quickly. I didn't even eat breakfast, just shoved everything in my bag and made my way back to the truck. But that wasn't the end. As I hiked back through the wet underbrush, I saw something that made me stop.
Bootprints.
They weren't mine. Mine had a distinct waffle pattern. These were heavier, flat-soled, like work boots. They came up the same way I had walked in, but they veered off to the left about 50 yards before the clearing. Then they looped around to the far side of the tent. I followed them with my eyes. They stopped exactly where I'd heard the first sound. Then, just 20 feet away, near the base of a thick fir, I saw something else. A crushed cigarette butt, still damp, still smelling faintly of tobacco. That's when I started to feel real fear. Someone had been watching me, maybe followed me in. Maybe they were already out there when I set up, and they were close enough to touch the tent. I kept moving. When I reached the truck, I noticed something else. Mud on the driver's side door handle. It hadn't rained that hard when I arrived the day before. I remembered wiping off the door with my sleeve before I unloaded. But now it had a fresh smudge, like someone had tried to open it. I climbed inside, locked the doors, and turned the engine over. I drove faster than I should have backed down that road. The tires slipped more than once, but I didn't care. I didn't stop until I hit pavement. I went home that same day. I showered and slept with a light on for the first time in years. Weeks went by, then months. I didn't talk to anyone about it. Not at first. What could I even say? There was no crime, no injury, nothing that made it easy to report. Just the kind of fear that clings to you in quiet moments. But then something else happened. In February, I got a call from my friend Mark, who works for a private land management company up in that part of Washington. He knew I liked camping and wanted to warn me. Apparently, a game warden found an illegal hunting camp out there. Off the grid, no permits, no ID. Just a tarp, some canned food, a fire pit, and a small radio. And something else. Maps with hand-marked trails, most of them logging roads and old campsites. One of those marks was the exact area I'd stayed. Nobody ever claimed it. They think the guy moved on. Maybe farther north. Maybe into Canada. Mark didn't think much of it. Just some loner living in the woods. But when he told me that, everything fell into place. That wasn't some lost hiker that night. That was someone who knew those woods better than I did. Someone who followed me in and watched me sleep. I still camp, but never alone. And never without double-checking the ground for prints before I set up. I was 34 years old the summer I decided to spend a week alone camping in Oregon, somewhere deep in the woods outside Gales Creek. It was 2019. I had just left a job I hated and wasn't ready to jump into another office so soon. I needed space, time to think, a reset. I'd done some camping in the past, mostly short trips, but this time I wanted something more isolated.
No campgrounds.
No marked trails, just me, a tent, some food, and the woods. I had a friend who used to hunt in the Tillamook State Forest, and he told me about a spot you could only reach by hiking in a couple miles off a rough logging road that was mostly forgotten now. He'd marked it on a paper map once, and I remembered it years later when I went searching for somewhere quiet. I took my old Subaru out there with my gear in the back, drove along Highway 6 until I turned off onto a narrow gravel road that got bumpier and less traveled the farther I went. No cell service. No other cars, just trees and dirt and the occasional sound of my tires crunching over loose stone. Eventually, the road got so bad I had to park. I threw on my pack, made sure I had my knife and bear spray clipped to my belt, and started walking. It took about an hour and a half of slow, careful hiking, moving around fallen logs and brush, before I reached the spot my friend told me about. It was a flat clearing above a small creek, surrounded by tall Douglas firs. Sunlight filtered through the trees in strips, and the only sound was water trickling over rocks. It was perfect. I set up my tent on the highest ground I could find, not far from the creek but safe in case of rain. I got a little fire going, cooked some freeze-dried chili on my tiny stove, and settled into the silence. That first night was calm, cool air, stars. I stayed awake a while, reading a paperback by headlamp, then crawled into my sleeping bag and drifted off. The next morning, I explored the area around the clearing.
No trals. No litter.
It felt untouched. I followed the creek downstream for a bit, then turned back when the slope got too steep. I took photos of moss-covered rocks and a giant tree that had fallen decades ago and now hosted a whole ecosystem on its bark. By late afternoon, I started hearing something, distant at first, just a rhythmic thud, like wood knocking on wood. I figured it was a branch falling or an animal knocking something loose, but it kept happening. Sometimes once every few minutes, sometimes in bursts, always far away. I'd pause and stare into the trees, listening. Then it would stop, and I'd hear nothing but wind and birds again. That night, I built a slightly larger fire. Not because I was scared, but because something about that sound unsettled me. I'm not the type to get spooked easily, but the knocking felt out of place, like it didn't belong in a place that quiet. I stayed up late that night listening. Around midnight, it stopped completely. No more knocking. I fell asleep eventually. The next day was cloudy and cooler. I went farther upstream and found an old fire ring, rocks in a circle blackened with soot. I hadn't seen it the day before. It was covered in leaves and had moss creeping up the sides of the rocks. But it wasn't that old. Maybe a year or two. Nearby, I found a rusted folding chair collapsed under a tree. The fabric was shredded and the frame bent, like someone had just left it there. I didn't think much of it at the time. People came through these woods, even if rarely. Hunters.
Campers.
Nothing weird about that. That evening, I went to get water from the creek and noticed something that hadn't been there before. Muddy footprints along the bank.
Bare footprints.
Human. Not big, not small either. Just average-sized, maybe like mine. But I hadn't taken my boots off once since I got there. I followed them with my eyes. They came out of the woods, walked along the bank, then disappeared again into the trees. I stood still for a long time, just listening. No sound. I went back to my camp and checked all my gear. Nothing was missing. My food was still there, untouched. But I had this prickling feeling at the base of my neck, like I was being watched. I didn't build a fire that night, just stayed in my tent with my headlamp off, listening. I didn't sleep much. Every time I started to drift off, I'd think I heard something. Footsteps, branches snapping. I told myself it was probably an animal. I waited until morning and got out of the tent. Everything looked normal. I made coffee and oatmeal, trying to act like nothing was weird. But I knew I couldn't ignore the footprints. I decided to cut the trip short. I packed up slowly, stuffing gear into my pack and checking all around the site for anything else out of place. I was halfway through rolling up my sleeping pad when I saw it. Tied to a tree just beyond the clearing, about 10 feet up, was a small strip of cloth, bright red. It stood out against the green and brown around it. I walked over and looked closer. It was a torn piece of flannel. Looked like it had been tied there on purpose. No other cloth around. Just that. I left right then. I started hiking back, and maybe 10 minutes in, I got that feeling again, that crawling, watching feeling. I stopped and looked behind me into the trees. Nothing. Just trees and shadows. I turned and kept walking. I walked faster than before. I started hearing things again. Not the knocking this time, just faint rustling behind me, like something moving parallel to my path. I'd stop and it would stop. I tried to stay calm, but my heart was racing. I reached the old logging road and nearly jogged the last stretch to my car. When I got there, I tossed my pack in the back and slammed the door. Before I even started the engine, I looked back up the trail I came from, and there he was, standing at the edge of the trees. A man, mid-40s maybe, dirty clothes, pale skin. I could barely make out his face, but I knew he was looking straight at me. He didn't move, didn't say anything, just stood there maybe 20 yards away. I drove out of there so fast I almost ran off the road twice. When I finally had cell service again, I pulled into a gas station and sat there for nearly an hour before I could even think clearly. I didn't call anyone. What would I say? There was no crime, no proof. Just a man in the woods who left bare footprints, watched me for days, and never said a word. I never went back there. I never will. A month later, out of curiosity, I searched around online to see if anything had ever happened near that area. There wasn't much. Just an old forum post from 2013 about someone hearing weird knocking sounds while camping west of Gales Creek. That was it. It doesn't sound like much. I know that. A few sounds. A guy standing in the woods. But when you're alone out there, miles from anyone, no help, no signal, that kind of thing gets under your skin. And the part one think about the most, the part that makes me sick when I remember it, is that the man never needed to do anything to scare me. He just had to be there, quiet, watching. That's enough. I camp now with friends, always somewhere busy. I still love nature, but I don't go deep into the woods alone anymore. Not because of bears or cougars or even the weather. I don't go because I know what it feels like to be watched by someone who has no reason to be there. Someone who doesn't want to be found, and who, if he'd wanted to, could have done anything, and no one would have ever known. It was late October 2013, and I still remember the cold in my bones even now. I was 32 then, working in an industrial maintenance team based out of eastern Pennsylvania. Our group was tight, 6 guys who had spent years traveling across counties fixing large machinery for remote plants and old facilities. Every year, we'd take a week off together and go camping. It was a way to unwind, stay close, and get away from the hum of machines and metal. We'd started doing it years ago, and by 2013, we were already on our 6th or 7th trip. That year, Travis suggested we go deep into the Allegheny National Forest. He'd read about a stretch of remote forest near Kane where there were almost no marked trails, just logging roads from decades ago and some old hunting cabins that had been long forgotten. The idea was to go further off-grid than usual, set up near a creek, and spend 4 or 5 days there. No phones, no GPS, no schedule. Our team that year was me, Travis, Luis, Joel, Benny, and Rick. All of us had solid camping experience. We weren't soft. We packed light but smart freeze-dried food, water filters, first aid, cold weather gear. Guns too. Not just for show. It was bear country. We split the weight among our packs and took one of our company's trucks as far as the old service road would go before loading everything onto our backs and walking the last few miles in. The hike in took us about 4 hours. The woods out there felt ancient. Pines thick as pillars, old-growth trees packed tight, and a forest floor that was soft and silent underfoot. It was beautiful, but not in a friendly way. More like something that didn't really care about you. You could feel that once you got deep enough. We found a good flat area near a narrow creek, far off from any established trail. A low hill sheltered one side, and the trees opened enough to give us a clear view of the sky without being exposed. We cleared the ground, pitched our tents, built a stone ring for the fire, and got camp set up. That first night was quiet, just cold wind and the sound of water trickling nearby. The next day, we split up to explore the area. We kept our handheld radios on and stayed within a 2-mile radius. Mostly, we just wandered. Rick spotted some old deer stands rotting high in the trees. Joel found what looked like a rusted-out hunting shack about a mile and a half east of camp. He said it was basically falling apart, just walls and a collapsed roof with animal scat all over the inside. He took a photo and showed us back at camp. That night, it got colder. You could feel the temperature dip fast after sunset. We cooked a hot meal and sat around the fire until the wood ran out, then zipped into our sleeping bags and tried to get some rest. That night was when things started to feel different. Around 2 in the morning, I woke up needing to pee. I got out of the tent, put on my boots, and walked just a few yards out into the woods. I kept my flashlight low so I wouldn't blind myself, and when I looked up, I saw something I didn't like. Not dangerous, just strange. There were drag marks in the pine needles, like something heavy had been pulled across the ground. It looked fresh. No leaves had settled back over it. It wasn't an animal path. I followed it with the light for a bit until it veered sharply downhill toward the creek. Then I turned around and went back to the tent. The next morning, I brought it up with Travis and the others. We chalked it up to a fallen log or maybe a deer carcass being dragged by a predator, but I could tell it made some of the guys uncomfortable. We spent the third day doing some light hiking and cutting more wood for the fire. Around noon, Joel and Luis went back to the old shack to get better photos. They had this thing about documenting old abandoned buildings. They took one of the radios and we heard from them once just to check in around 1:30. After that, it went quiet. No more radio contact. By 3 o'clock, Travis got uneasy and decided to head out after them. He told me and Rick to stay at camp while he and Benny took the second radio and followed the trail. They were gone for over an hour. When they came back, they were white-faced and tight-lipped. They didn't talk right away, just stood by the fire rubbing their hands together. Then Travis told us what happened. He said they found the shack and Joel and Luis weren't there, but it looked like someone had recently been inside. Not just them, someone else. The floor had fresh boot prints, much larger than ours. There were broken twigs, a pile of feathers, and a coat Joel had been wearing, folded and left on a stump. No blood, no sign of a struggle, just wrong. We all looked at each other. Rick started pacing. The sun was already dropping behind the trees. We decided to leave camp intact but packed our day packs and flashlights and went out in a group of 4 to search in a wider arc around the shack. We split into 2 pairs. I was with Rick. The woods out there got dark fast. The light faded from gray to black within an hour. We didn't find anything except a set of faint prints that led deeper northeast. They were wide, boot style, and deep. Whoever made them was heavy. Rick and I tried to follow them, but the ground turned rocky and we lost the trail. We called out on the radios but got no reply. We got back to camp just after nightfall. Still no sign of Joel or Luis. Their gear was all still at camp. Packs, jackets, food, everything. That made no sense. That night, we built the biggest fire we could and kept watch in shifts. I didn't sleep. I sat with the shotgun across my lap and stared into the trees. Couple times I thought I heard something. Branches snapping in slow sequence. Not from animals running through, but like something steady was walking and trying not to make noise. Travis heard it too. He looked at me across the fire and nodded slowly. At first light, we decided to hike back to the truck, drive to town, and report them missing. We left everything at camp and started moving. It was a brutal, silent walk. No one talked. We felt watched the whole time, like something was keeping pace behind the trees. When we got to the truck, we found the driver's side mirror cracked and turned inward, like someone had pushed it. There were smudges on the glass, long streaks like dirt-covered fingers. That was it. We drove into Kane and reported what happened. The rangers and local sheriff took it seriously, especially after we showed the photos and the GPS coordinates of the shack. A search team went out that day, and we waited in town, huddled in a diner, drinking coffee none of us wanted. They found Joel and Luis the next day. Both of them were alive, but they weren't right. They were picked up walking along an old service road 10 miles north of where they were last seen. No memory of how they got there. Luis had bruises along both arms and a torn lip. Joel was barefoot and had a deep gash across his right palm. Neither could speak properly for a while. They just stared and shook. After medical treatment and some time, Joel finally explained what little he remembered. He said someone was living in those woods, not in the shack beyond it. A man, huge and silent, who watched from the trees. No words, no sound, just presence. He said they were walking back to camp when they got separated, and then it was like they couldn't find the way. No matter how far they walked, they were going in circles. Luis fell and got hurt, and Joel tried to carry him, but he blacked out. When he woke up, it was daylight and they were near a dirt road. The rangers did a second search, this time with dogs, and found an old, buried hunting shelter half dug into the side of a hill about 2 miles from the shack. Inside were bones, animal mostly, deer skulls, bird bones, squirrel skeletons, but also clothes, human clothes, tattered, stained, faded from age. Some were children's sizes. There were knives, dull and rusty, and a single cot made from bundled branches and animal hide. Whoever had been living there was gone. They called off the search after that. Told us it was likely some survivalist or hermit that had been out there for years. No official statement. No warning signs put up. Just a quiet note in the report and a suggestion that hikers stay near marked trails. We never went camping again after that. To this day, we don't know who he was or how long he'd been watching. We don't talk about it much. Joel moved out west. Luis never went back to work. The rest of us stayed close but changed somehow. We stick to cities now, to people and roads and noise. Sometimes I still think about the drag marks I saw in the dark. The smudge on the mirror. The prints that led into the rocks and vanished. I think we got lucky. We left when we did. If we had stayed one more night, if we had gone further into the woods looking for answers, I don't think I'd be here writing this. I think we got too close to something that didn't want to be found, and it let us leave, but just barely.